World Bank Group is an institution that owned by most of the countries in the world. So
Sure.
Sri Lanka and its people are our shareholders.
Sure.
And we want to be seen as a cooperative where they can get both advice, international experience, and also, of course, different array of financing, public and private.
Sri Lanka's economic crisis has hurt the poor the most. In fact, now 25% of the population is estimated to be under the poverty line versus 11% poverty before the crisis hit. During the economic crisis, the World Bank, a multilateral lender, supported Sri Lanka by redirecting its existing loan facilities to maintain essential food, medicine, and fuel imports, and after that, it provided $500 million to support the government's budget, the last of which was transferred to the government a few weeks ago. To resume budget support loans, the government will have to propose a new program of reforms and enter into fresh negotiations with the World Bank. Hello, you're with Echelon, and in the studio today is Gevorg Sargsyan, who is the head of the World Bank Group in Sri Lanka. Gevorg, welcome to Echelon. The World Bank's interest is in reducing poverty around the world. And Sri Lanka has had a particularly difficult time with poverty in the last few years due to the economic crisis and its knock-on effects on people and their livelihoods. Over the last year or more, Sri Lanka has enacted several reforms, and it seems the economy is no longer in crisis, but there seems to be some way to go before Sri Lanka can restore what it enjoyed in 2018 or 2019 when it was enjoying stable economic growth. Now, if you were to outline some priorities to accelerate Sri Lanka's emergence out of this current crisis, what do you think those priorities should be?
A few words about World Bank Group. I'm sure people know about it, but maybe just for the context, World Bank Group is an institution that owned by most of the countries in the world. So
Sure.
Sri Lanka and its people are our shareholders.
Sure.
And we want to be seen as a cooperative, if I may say so, for our members, where they can get both advice, international experience, help to tailor it to local needs, and also, of course, different array of financing, public and private. So that's a little bit about the World Bank Group. Now, in terms of priorities, indeed, Sri Lanka went through the worst economic crisis in the modern history. I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
Very painful what people went through in terms of poverty, loss of income, loss of job, very devastating. I wasn't here, but I was very carefully watching these developments. And it's impressive how well it has stabilized the economy and how fast it has done,
Right.
despite the odds. And many people did not expect it to happen so quickly. But stabilization is not recovery. So I think that's a very important distinction I want to highlight. So the recovery is going to be quite difficult, complex, and there is narrow path for a proper recovery. What I mean by this is that even after that restructuring, which is still being finalized, so I don't want to sort of talk much about this, there still will be significant debt burden after several years. And so the only way out of this is really sustainable growth. So let me maybe use a metaphor. So if you want to feed a family, you have a pie, but if you really want to make sure that everyone is well fed, you want a bigger pie, you want well nutritious pie, and you want also to sort of distribute it a little bit in an equitable way, right? So this is very much about Sri Lankan economy.
Right.
So if you have these ambitious plans that including the new government has in terms of development, infrastructure, services, access, so you need bigger economy, because bigger economy means also more revenues, more expenditures. You also want more diversified and well-paying sort of nutritious economy, if I may say so. And you also want to make sure that everyone benefits from the economy, particularly the poor people do benefit. So it's really inclusive, right? So this is one. Now, what are the areas for this growth? One will be agriculture and value added in agriculture. And that's a very probably staple concept for Sri Lanka. Agriculture has been a big part, but value addition in Sri Lankan economy is relatively limited. The other one will be energy and electricity. With the reforms that have been taking place right now, it does create an opportunity to crowd in investments into clean energy that will allow to reduce cost of energy, immediately sharing these benefits with people and businesses, but also will have other benefits like energy security, environmental benefits, and so on. The other is tourism. Tourism has been growing at a rapid pace, and it's almost getting to the pre-crisis level. Not there completely, but there. But the sustainable and value-added aspect of this still can be enhanced, and that means also much more left in the country, and then better care of the infrastructure environment. Those are some of the examples of what it means. So that will be number one. The other is really very much about governance. It's improving governance. And we can talk more about this, but let me pause here.
Right. Sri Lanka's nominal GDP shrunk by 30% or more, I think, from the peak in 2020.
More like 10%.
Nominal GDP?
Since the crisis 2022, first year it was 7%, second about 3% overall, 10% contraction.
Right.
Real, yeah.
This is
real. Sorry.
Yeah. That is real GDP, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Sri Lanka's real GDP has shrunk by 10%. And, of the last 5 years, I think 4 have seen negative GDP growth in Sri Lanka. So this is fairly unprecedented, even by the standards of Sri Lanka. And you highlight several priority areas for focus. But let's assume we want to put the economy, and we are a little impatient about this. We want to do some catch up. We want to do it fast. We've seen that the region, particularly India in this region, is growing very fast. And Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Cambodia are growing even faster than the South Asian average, I think. Assume Sri Lanka wants now to untap its potential, if that exists. What should we be doing in terms of making it possible for these and other sectors to generate higher growth?
Yeah. So I think there are several aspects of it. One is increasing trade, particularly export. Sri Lanka, we have estimated in our latest economic update that Sri Lanka has about $10 billion equivalent untapped export potential in several sectors.
Just for context, Sri Lanka's exports are about $12 billion a year, $13 billion a year, and you're suggesting there is a 10 billion untapped potential. Yeah. Okay.
And it means also hundreds of thousands of jobs, among other things. That, of course, means massive addition to the revenues. This is very much to the pie discussion we had, right?
Okay.
So the other is really investments, particularly foreign direct investments, bringing them to countries so that it can really boost this potential. Now, in the last 2 decades, Sri Lanka has started looking more and more inward. The export to GDP share has gone down in about 2 decades from about 40% to 20%. That's a massive contraction of a country that has huge potential for export. And by the way, why I think Sri Lanka has huge potential of export, one is its geography. It's just naturally a hub between a logistical center between parts of Asia, between Asia and Africa, Asia and Europe, and so on. It does have a very good port infrastructure. We can be further developed, and then many clusters built around that. It has also very skilled labor, which can add value in many ways, right? Many countries like talking about Singapore as an example. So if you look at Singapore, all these ingredients are there. Openness of the economy, very high share of export, but also very low barriers to enter, and cluster developments around the port. So to become like Sri Lanka, these policies also needs to be implemented. The other aspect I mentioned is investments, FDIs, foreign direct investments in particular. It's very difficult now to invest in Sri Lanka when we speak to investors. It's about lack of predictability, a very complex set of rules, multiple institutions that one needs to deal with. It's lack of transparency, a perception of corruption. And because countries compete for investors and not the other way around, these investors are picky, right? And they basically say, we don't see that there is right environment. But again, just to want to reemphasize that the potential is there, and trade and investment come together. So, for Sri Lankan industries to export, they also need to be able to bring some of the inputs. Not everything is produced in Sri Lanka, and it's also very difficult to import important input materials for further production, for agriculture, for industries and so on. So those are the examples of what needs to be done.
I want to see if you can help unpack this. You are suggesting Sri Lanka's exports are pretty low, equivalent to about 20% of GDP, and that we're not very attractive as an FDI destination. And you're suggesting the two are also linked. You can't fix one without fixing the other, right? Assume we want to start fixing this, and you highlighted briefly some areas of concern. Gevorg, I'll ask you to be a little bit more specific. Help us drill down and identify 1, 2, 3 problems here that are within easy fixing. Maybe it's new legislation, maybe it's a new policy, maybe it's a new regulation. What are these things that we can start fixing?
Let me give you an example. Let me add one more thing. In terms of FDI, Sri Lanka has been hovering around 1% of GDP, and most of it has been construction, investment, and so on, right? So Vietnam, I think you mentioned, was 4 or 5% of GDP per capita, right? So that's the context. Now, one is removing some of the limitations. For example, transport and logistics is out of limit for investments for foreign companies in Sri Lanka. I don't know why. I don't understand why. But this is one of the areas of high potential. The other is creating single window and this is not for FDI, it's for any investors, for Sri Lankan exporters and importers, as much or more than for anyone else, so that you can get all your documents processed, all your permits obtained through one entry point, through single window, digital economy and digital government. That also removes many of the layers and potential misuse of power. And this is, by the way, very consistent with what this current government wants to do. I understand digital e-government, is a big part of that, right? So these are some of examples what can be done immediately. The Economic Transformation Act does provide a foundation for many of these elements. It is about boosting competitiveness, about simplifying cost of doing business, about creating institutions which will facilitate this. To give you an example, the BOI, the Board of Investment, which has as part of their mandate to encourage investments, so only 1% of their staff works on facilitating investment. 99% of them work on some form of regulations. The production zones and things like that, right? So it's a very, sort of skewed incentive scheme. So those are just a few examples of specific things that can be done pretty quickly and can have a massive, massive effect.
Sri Lanka's government revenue versus the size of the economy is also rather low. Tax revenue is about 8% equivalent of GDP. It's very low compared to, it's double that or more in countries of similar state of development in most cases. You're talking about removing trade barriers, perhaps reducing taxes on trade, right? help us reconcile this, in one way that will reduce the amount of income the government has. How can this help propel Sri Lanka forward when we are already a low government revenue country?
Yeah. Indeed, I think one of senior official told me once that Sri Lanka has its social protection system mimicking Nordic countries and has taxation system of Hong Kong, which is one of the lowest in the world, right? So, and there is a mismatch of that.
Sure.
It used to be 7% during the 7% tax to GDP during the crisis. I think we are up to 12-13% now. So it has been significant increase over the last few years. But as you said, most countries, even in the region, will be closer to 20%. And that's where you need to be if you want to, provide all the key services and also have the kind of welfare society and economy. Sri Lanka has been very proud of its health education systems, rightly so, right? But it needs significant funding to continue. So let me give you examples of what can be done. Just by eliminating the special exemptions given to multitude of companies, foreign, locals, and so on, and by addressing tax administration. So we're not talking about any new tax increases. We can generate between 3 to 5% of taxes per GDP. So that is additional 3 to 5%. That's a huge number, right? That includes, of course, administration of the customs. Some of the trade is going to generate more revenue, not less. By encouraging trade, you will also have a taxation, both direct and indirect. Now, I'm not a big proponent of increasing indirect taxes further, like VAT, because they are regressive, meaning they penalize poor people much more than rich people. So I'm much more for a progressive system of taxation, meaning fixing more the income taxes, asset declarations, making sure that rich people and rich companies pay their fair share of this, right? And for that, you need the direct taxation much more than indirect taxation.
Interesting. You mentioned a $10 billion untapped export potential right, in Sri Lanka. How do you come across? How do you sort of figure that out? How do you come with that number? And it's a number that was recently published in the Sri Lanka Development Update in September 2024. Can you explain how you arrive at that?
Yeah, well, it's a methodology that has been used across many countries, and we have a robust team working on this. I won't be able to give you all the intricacies and elements of this one, right? But it's sort of looking at labor, at what the markets want, what is your potential supply of inputs, and what was the trajectory and so on. Businesses, what is their sort of own vision and so on, and sort of coming with that picture. But the report itself does provide details. So I very much encourage people to go online and read, including a little bit more about the methodology of that.
Right. And then coming back to those comments on taxation and how Sri Lanka can do better on progressive taxation, basically asking those who can afford to pay a little bit more than everybody else. Sri Lanka has been talking about widening the tax net, keeping people who, bringing people who aren't in the tax net but who should be into it for decades now, right? What are we getting wrong? What about the Sri Lankan tax system or the wider system of governance is wrong that we don't seem to be able to achieve this, despite knowing this fact for, 2-3 decades, for as long as I've been engaging on this, we've known this.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid that's very much in the heart of having political will to do that and strengthening institutions to do that. I think that's, it's easier said than that, but this is really in the heart of that. Political will is maybe 80% of that, but institutions, their independence, the strength, and again, we talked about Economic Transformation Act, it does call for strengthening of some of the or creation of some of this institution. We supported strengthening central banks legislation exactly to allow central bank to avoid failures of the government and functioning of the banking sector in the future, to minimize risk of 2022. So I think those are the two main elements in reality. If they come together, then you can really make a major advance in that area.
You mentioned at the outset that Sri Lanka's economy has certainly stabilized, but the path to recovery is a long one, and that we have a fairly narrow path. We can't afford many missteps, right? If Sri Lanka were to think medium term, hopefully Sri Lanka will strike a deal with its commercial creditors soon. The outlines of such an agreement are now available. It requires final legal work and signing, perhaps, assuming we cross that boundary and we are no longer in default. And Sri Lanka is now thinking about medium term. Okay, from now, next 3, 4, even 5 years, about the changes we need to be making on top of the short-term changes that have already been done. Help us establish several priorities that you think are then important for a country.
Yeah. So this will be a little bit of recapping part of the discussion we are having, right? So a big part is about growth and policies around growth. Like I gave several examples. This can be expanded further in the medium term, entering into free trade agreements with several countries, because again, country with unique location and potential like Sri Lanka will benefit a lot from this trade. So it's all this, going back to the pie story. So this is a big one. The other one is we will still have many people remaining poor for a while, right? So in the last few years, we have seen more than doubling of poverty, from hard-won reduction of poverty to about 11% pre-crisis. We now have about 26% of people who are poor. Like every fourth Sri Lankan is poor, and millions more are shook away from that poverty. And our projection in the base case scenario, and I hope that we will have faster progress there, that it will stay in above 20% for still several years. So it's important to make sure that these policies do support and protect these people through a robust social protection system and much more efficient and well-targeted social assistance system. It also probably means consolidating it. There are so many social protection programs that often administration cost can be as high as what you actually distribute, right? We believe that cash transfer is one of the most effective ways, because people are capable of making their decisions where to prioritize. And we have a lot of other programs. Fertilizer program is one of the most expensive ones. And I think it requires a lot of also attention in terms of how maybe even monetizing it, or at least making better targeting. And again, we are very keen to support. So that's retraining of these people, providing access to sort of new ways of gaining skills to be able to be reintegrated in the economy. That's the second block of things in the medium term that needs to be addressed. Part of this, of course, is thinking about education, vocational training, about higher education, and how it all comes together in this modern area. And the third part is the governance. So governance, there are multiple things there. A big part of it is SOE reforms. Unfortunately, SOEs, state-owned enterprises, have been part of the problem, and to some extent even contributed to crisis for several reasons. Lack of transparency. Many of them were loss-making. State-owned banks were often probably pressured or encouraged to finance them. As a result, they have accumulated a lot of debts that are hard to recover, and they may not have been providing necessarily the kind of services to population that one would expect, right? They were not competing. Usually when we go to supermarket and we want to get milk, we don't want to have just one brand of milk there, right? So and multiple brands. That goes for everything, for any service. So you want competition, you want market. So SOEs is a big part of that. And again, multiple, including electricity sector. I think there is a big potential in bringing competition within the institution, bringing more investments if these reforms, the pace of them continues. Bringing more competitive procurement and transparent procurement is absolutely essential, right? That is better spending, that's more level playing field for businesses to participate in and benefit for everyone. So again, a lot of digital solutions there can help a lot. And I keep going back to this government's, manifesto or their priorities. Digital government is one of the parts of it. And I think this is an essential part of improving governance, strengthening anti-corruption institutions, empowering anti-corruption institutions will be another important element of that. So those are in the medium term, these are the three big blocks of priorities that will help country to walk through that narrow path we talked about, avoid repeating same mistakes, but more importantly, creating shared prosperity for its people, which really deserve it. They have all the rights to demand it, and there is all the potential there in this country to deliver.
Several months ago, within the last 2 years, the government sort of named 80 plus SOEs as ones that are engaged in commercial activity, the type of activity that perhaps can be done by the private sector, or there'd be willing private investors to do that kind of activity. And among them were, Sri Lankan Airlines, Sri Lanka Telecom, several buildings put up to be, as hotels that were owned by the government. And it was the policy then to sell these assets to private investors outrightly. Some of them already had private investment in them, partial. From the World Bank's point of view and its future support to a government, budget support to a government, loans to support the budget, is it important that Sri Lanka have a very clear policy on SOEs that can be privatized, that can be, handed over to private investors to be owned and managed?
Yeah. No, I don't think World Bank has any sort of one size fit all solution. The reason why privatization is often useful good is ability to mobilize both expertise and financing. In Sri Lanka, we spoke a lot about that. The fiscal space is very limited. Like taxation is small. We talked about 13% need to increase, and so many programs, social protection, all need to be funded, infrastructure. One cannot expect that government will be able to finance all of that. It's just there is no that space. So where does this money come from? They do come from the market. Now, you can have very efficient SOEs in theory that are able to raise money from the market and act in such a way, but it's difficult. It's difficult, but this is one way to go. There are several other models of bringing private sector. One doesn't need to privatize. One can go into concessional arrangements with it, right? So then that means that that asset ultimately remains with the government and it's being, managed and invested by a private sector and coming back. And there's several other things. But again, we will engage with the government and we'll see how we can help. SOE reforms are essential. There are different models to do that. And different SOEs will require different probably approaches. Maybe there are multiple solutions for each of them. But the bottom line, efficiency of the SOEs need to improve governance, transparency, and the ability to operate as a fully commercial entity is critical. What is the ownership of that? It depends again on...
Sri Lanka has tried on several occasions by setting up holding institutions, companies that, want to help, manage these SOEs and shield them from the pressures that come from, various actors who are associated with the government. We don't seem to have succeeded. And if you look at the last crisis, I think electricity, petroleum, and the national airlines losses contributed significantly to weakening of the state balance sheet. we will continue to carry the risk if we keep trying the same solution for a known problem, won't we?
Yeah. What is the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing and trying to and expecting different results. Yeah. No, I think one is again. It goes a little bit to political will and so on, because sometimes indeed you can actually try a solution, but if you properly implemented, then the impact can be powerful. Again, we are going back to some of the sectors like electricity. Sri Lanka is one of the highest cost of electricity in the region, and it doesn't have to, because it has huge potential also for renewable energy, right? But it has not had much of competition in the sectors, and hence we are having there. So, holding, I don't know, it depends. This is just a concept, right? And often it's a temporary concept if you know where you are going. I don't know whether it's itself a solution or an end goal. So depends on specifics of that.
Right. What we don't, or what most people won't realize immediately about you is that you spent several years in Sri Lanka working on the electricity sector in Sri Lanka, right? And I think Sri Lanka is now seeing the introduction of a new act to unbundle the sector, separate out the units under the Ceylon Electricity Board that did generation, that did distribution, and transmission, in the long-term transmission of power, right? So the framework has now been established. There is also an independent regulator in place. What should... now, I suppose it's now a matter of rolling things out, right? If we were to do this successfully and untap the potential, the pricing potential, the competition in the sector, how should Sri Lanka now start approaching it? Because there seems to be there is now a new electricity law in place, which is the first time that we've had something like that, in the last 20 years. We've been talking about it for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. I had the privilege to manage our energy program for Sri Lanka between 2008 2012. That's where I fell in love with Sri Lanka. And I did travel a lot throughout the country, because that's where we were supporting, all the small and micro hydro industry, the first solar, investments, first wind investments. So it also gave me all the exposure to the country. But indeed, this was 15, 17 years ago, and we were indeed at that point we're discussing very much the same challenges.
Sort of challenges.
So it's a very exciting moment, in a way, a landmark moment, that now we have this Electricity Act with a very clear timeline on how to implement and what to do. And you mentioned unbundling as part of it. And unbundling is important indeed, as you said, because it does create transparency. It brings transparency and creates competition. Competition between, generation companies, even if they are state-owned. It creates ability for the regulator to have so-called benchmark competition between distribution companies. So one can compare, this distribution company is providing better services in this area than the other. So what is right, what is wrong? So how do we make sure that the other one follows? It does bring competition for, talent, human resource. Means more people would like to go and become engineers or electricity energy economists and so on, right? So there's multiple benefits. But the Act has many other important provisions. It's a pathway to opening the market in a phased way. That means usually, if properly done, more investments, lower cost. It also has provisions about transparent procurement. Going back to what we're saying, it does mandate all new procurement of generation to be done in a competitive way. And we are very keen to support the government. I just came this morning from a meeting with the Ministry of Power, exactly discussing how we can help the government to move it in that direction, and they are very keen to move in that direction, of course.
One thing has been that sometimes it has been stated in the past that large projects or ones around renewable energy haven't been procured competitively. Should Sri Lanka, if it's possible, re-look at some of the decisions that have been made to see if there are better solutions for that procurement in the electricity sector in particular?
So I know for sure that moving forward, doing it in a competitive way, it will yield the benefit of low and high quality services. I don't have enough of knowledge of the past procurements that have been done. I understand that they're being now subject to some scrutiny, and some of them may or may not go through this. I don't know. I don't have enough of, based on my 3 months in Sri Lanka in this round, enough of knowledge to say whether or not any of this should continue. I believe that there will be due process. By the way, you mentioned quite a few times regulator. This act also empowers the regulator and makes it much stronger. And the role of regulator is critical because it is a balancing power to protect interests both of consumers and of investors. And finding that right balance is very complex things, and trying to depoliticize it. And the role of the regulator is partially to do that, is there. And from my experience from other countries, if you have a market, then regulator plays much more effective role. If regulator is just regulating one giant entity, it's much harder to do it. It's just they're in different sort of leagues, if I may say.
And there are no benchmarks to compare, like you said, one company against the other.
It's very hard to enforce even regulations. I know in the past regulators tried, but it's very hard because you have very, very powerful institution, and there is no alternative to that.
Sure. Right? Gevorg, can you give us some background to what the World Bank has done to support Sri Lanka in the last two years plus, when everything came to a head, and we had those long queues for fuel, there were 10-hour power cuts. From that point, what has the World Bank done particularly to help Sri Lanka?
No, I'm very proud of what my colleagues here have done, and I cannot claim any credit for that, but I am very proud of what we have been doing. We repackaged, we sort of restructured our existing portfolio.
Yeah.
We had about $3 billion and so on. And we channeled immediately a significant chunk of this money to support purchase of fuel, food, medicine, fertilizer. So this was one big part of what we have been doing. The other was immediately engaging with the government and supporting with stabilization efforts, with also bringing some of the expertise, advising, and then significant funding went into budget to stabilize it. We also helped to look at how poor and vulnerable people can be protected by better targeting and distribution of funding, cash transfers, and so on, and helping to strengthen the social benefit system. Of course, there is a long way to go. Yeah. So and then focusing on areas that can start generating growth. We started sort of looking at some of these areas and investments. Right now, for example, we are discussing, agricultural program that will allow to add very much along the lines of climate smart agriculture that also allows crowding in private sector and adding value in agri-processing and so on. We are discussing potential of, scaling up renewable energy investments by crowding investments. So these are the examples of what we have done or are doing right now.
From what I understand, the World Bank just granted a $200 million budget support loan, which means this is a loan that the government can use for everyday expenses, according to the budget, budget approved everyday expenses. That follows up on a $500 million loan for budget support previously?
So it was a package of several tranches.
Sure.
This was 200 million, I believe 300 million before. And indeed, the way it works, we supported government reform in certain areas. So Electricity Act is one of them. The Economic Transformation Act, the improvement of administration of taxes, debt management. A lot of what we spoke about was supporting them. And then usually the way it works, when these policies are done, then we, against the policies, we disburse funding into the general budget, which is then used to cover expenditures, right? And so yes, indeed, we just signed it because all the, what we call prior actions, or all the policy plans were implemented, so we can go ahead now and disburse funds.
Sri Lanka, as you said, is in heading towards recovery. So it's conceivable that we may still require some support from multilateral lenders like the World Bank, right? Should Sri Lanka want to do that, is it imperative that we have an active IMF program in place for a multilateral lender like the World Bank to give budget support?
For the budget support, for in the current environment, it is package.
So there has to be a corresponding IMF agreement in place
for the current environment. Yes.
Right.
But we have, of course, investment programs, etc., that we do regardless of any programs. But I see now first seemingly strong commitment to continue with the IMF program and many benefits, because a lot of the ideas in the program are homegrown ideas. They are, it's something that many parts of the society and government and businesses wanted to do, and it was an ability then, as a Chinese proverb goes, every crisis is an opportunity. So there was a very painful, but an opportunity to build on that and sort of move forward what I think country wanted to do for a long time. So that's how I see it.
Right. Obviously, there's been a delay in the review for the next tranche of the IMF program. It's conceivable. We're now going into a second election, and there'll probably have to be an annual budget presented for 2025 before anything substantial can happen on that review. But this is, there's a good 2 years to run on this program. And just to understand, is it, you said a current environment, does it mean that, we should run with this program for the next 2 years too, to sort of unlock the potential aid from the World Bank?
Yeah. Look, I know that government is actively now engaged with IMF, and I'm not privy to this discussion, so I'll let them respond probably to this question. I think there are many benefits of, continuing the path of the reforms that is part of that program. And there are also financial benefits. There are substantial, financial inflows in the environment where access to markets might still be limited for some time. I think you mentioned it in the beginning of discussion as well. So that's reality. But I'll let the parties to sort of decide the way forward.
So if Sri Lanka is going to have a tough time with the budget over the next few years, to fund the deficit or to fund its expenditure simply by way of the revenue it generates, it'll need some grant or aid assistance or loans from World Bank and other multilaterals. What are the likely prior actions? Now, you said we had a set of prior actions that now Sri Lanka has completed and has unlocked $500 million in the last couple of years, I think in the last year or so, of budget assistance. And you highlighted what those prior actions were. What are the areas in which the government will have to propose reforms, you think? Or what are the areas that you feel Sri Lanka's economy can benefit the most with reform that will then result in the World Bank coming forward with further budget assistance?
Yeah, let me explain how our financing evolves, right? When we prepared our strategy, it's actually called Country Partnership Framework. It was done in 2023, and it is a 4-year strategy. So the plan was that for 18 months, the focus will be on stabilizing the economy.
Sure.
All emphasis was on stabilizing the economy. And as we discussed, it has been fairly successfully completed and in a time frame that not many expected. Then the strategy says that, look, there is then formal review of this, and then the second phase is to support, assuming that stabilization happened, we support sustainable green growth.
Sure.
And this is very much where we are right now.
Sure.
So we have now a new government. We'll have new government after the parliamentary elections. We do have no new leadership. And this is a very good timing for us to discuss the next phase of the strategy. So in the coming months, we'll be engaging with the government and we'll be discussing what are their priorities that they'd like us to support. They have a multitude of areas they want to move forward. Many of them in the economic area resonate with us. Again, we covered several of them. Agriculture is their value-added. Tourism, sustainable tourism is there. The renewable energy, they have a 2 gigawatt target, I think within 4 years of added renewable
capacity.
Energy. And we are very keen to support it. The whole governance and anti-corruption infrastructure, competitiveness, SOE reforms, all of these are areas that we are very keen to support. What are the instruments? Depends. It can be a combination of investment and budget support and, or some of it. But important to keep in mind that these funds are all limited funds, especially for Sri Lanka now, a country reverse graduated in a special concessional window. It's called IDA, International Development Association. That means, of course, much more concessional funding, but they are much more limited. It has reverse graduated because of the crisis. So this funding from us and other partners is going to be relatively limited. Using these funds in a smart way by supporting right policies, by improving revenue collection, growing the pie, encouraging and bringing private investments, that's how we make impact, not just about our money. It can do relatively little from very ambitious plans that the government has or the public expects.
Right. If you look at trend World Bank support over the medium term, let's look at the last 10 years. Has the World Bank given significantly more support during the crisis than it had on trend in the past, even when Sri Lanka had access to IBRD and IDA both at one point?
It definitely disbursed money immediately, basically provided money much more than in the past, and especially on this very concessional terms. So we moved very quickly. Usually our projects, because of their nature, development project building things, so it takes several years to plan, procure, and so on. But there we moved very quickly with massive disbursement to help to stabilize the economy and to help people to minimize the pain they were enduring. Of course, it still was very, very, very painful, and many of them continue enduring it.
One thing people feel about reforms is that there's nothing in it for me, and they are sometimes very critical about the sorts of trickle-down economics. You change something, and the benefits will trickle down to everybody in the economy. What would you say to somebody who is skeptical about the reform program that Sri Lanka has undertaken in the last couple of years and its ability to help people, the poorest, the 25% of 26% of Sri Lankans who are below the poverty line now?
Yeah. So, trickle-down economy has also a formal definition. I don't know whether this is the one you are using. It is usually about providing, tax benefits and exemptions to big businesses, thinking that then that sort of trickles down.
That higher investment will trickle down.
So I am not a big supporter of the trickle-down economy if we are talking about this specific definition. I don't think many economists are actually. This might be more of a sort of vested interest theory, because that trickling down is not necessarily happening all the time. So that's sort of about that specific theory. But broader concept, first of all, people have all the rights to be skeptical and impatient. The their experience in a way allows them to be so, right? And yeah, they have seen stabilization, but the quality of life for many hasn't improved. Yeah, it's not yet even at the pre-crisis level.
Sure.
Many of the policies they have put in place, but implementation is still ahead of us. So I would advise the leadership to really focus on things that can be delivered quickly. Not everything will be delivered quickly. Some of this is going to be costly. And again, it's going to be back to growing the pie and improving, revenues and so on, right? But there are areas with eliminating some of the loopholes, the exemptions, tax administration, e-government, those things moving quickly with some of the important investments like renewable energy investments, because this can help to reduce costs at a fairly rapid, pace. Single windows we discussed for businesses, investors and so on. There are many things that are relatively low-hanging fruits. They are implementation of these policies, and implementation is more important than the policy itself in a way, right? So because there have been so many policies in different countries that were never implemented. So that is the focus, and that's where then people will start seeing and feeling it, and hopefully then we'll start appreciating that in a different way it trickles down.
Gevorg, this has been a fairly wide-ranging discussion. Anything you think you need to add to round it off?
I think we have covered it all. Thanks for actually keeping, the spotlight on these important issues. I think you have asked, fairly wide range of questions when we've covered most of the points.
Gevorg Sargsyan, thank you for joining Echelon.
Thank you so much. It was great.